Sanitary Transportation Rule today, and of course be getting quite a few updates on the FSMA front as well. Our intent is to keep this within our half-hour time frame. We'll hopefully have time for a few questions as well, and we'll go ahead and get started. So just a few reminders, and we always put, thank goodness it's FSMA Fridays. We will be sending out a recording link on Monday as always. We have some pre-submitted questions we'll be going through today. For those that are having audio difficulties, I'm hearing it through computer speakers, go ahead and call into the number that is provided. And with that, we'll go ahead and begin. So I'm absolutely, as always, delighted to have David Acheson and Rolando Gonzalez on with us today, as well as a third guest with the tag team, Christopher Snabes. I should make mention that I was going to call this session live from Shanghai because both David and Rolando are joining us from afar. But good morning, everyone, or evening to you all.
Good morning, Jill. Pleasure to be with you all, and welcome everybody to another FSMA Friday. Absolutely. Sounds good.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. David, please, what is the latest on FSMA?
Yeah, no, absolutely, Jill. I mean, a couple of things. The first is, for those of you who don't get our regular tag newsletters, the one that we've just written is about whistleblowers. And you may remember way back when we talked about FSMA when it first came out, one of the provisions in that statute was whistleblower protection. That regulation is final. It came out just very recently, and we summarized it in our recent newsletter, in fact. No great surprises in the final rule. It tracks, and it does indeed do what we thought it would, which is to protect whistleblowers in food companies. Our take on that is that we don't expect it's going to shake up a lot of things. It's going to make a big difference, but it is squarely protecting whistleblowers. But it's under OSHA. It's not under FDA. So that's one update. And the second is that, as Rolando reminded me earlier this week, with all of the training that's going on, and everybody's aware that PCQI training is well underway, and the FDA has now apparently popped out an announcement that training on the animal rule is coming up very soon. I don't believe, from what Rolando said, that this is actually kind of publicly available yet, but those people who have done the human rule training are getting notified about the animal rule training coming right up behind it. So, Rolando, if I didn't quite get that quite right, then jump in a little later and you can fill us in. So, but those are the key things, Jill. I will comment. Everybody is still waiting for guidance, but I think we're all resigned to having to crank on with preventive control rules without it. It just doesn't seem forthcoming, and I've heard absolutely nothing about when it might show up, unfortunately. So with that, back to you.
Okay, interesting about the guidance. I know we spoke about that last month, so I was hoping it would be the other answer there. Let's go ahead and dive into, not quite. Let's go ahead and dive then into our topic. Obviously, the sanitary transport final rule has come out, and we certainly have some good questions around that to discuss. And again, I think, sanitary transportation of human and animal food, that last part always seems to get lopped off in communications out there. So, David, I'm going to go ahead and just ask you to address the first question that came in, just the general purpose of the rule.
Yeah, I think the first point to make on the rule is it is a relatively straightforward, simple rule, number one. There's no big surprises. For those of you who were tracking with the proposed rule, the final rule is not that different, but there's some important nuances which we're going to touch on during the course of this conversation. The purpose of it, really, I would say, if I could put it in a nutshell, is to codify industry best practice for transport of food. I think the FDA in their comments make it pretty clear that they're not trying to reinvent the wheel here with this rule. They're basically trying to make it a regulatory requirement that industry best practices are followed with regard to the transportation of food. In the proposed rule, there were a bunch of exemptions. We'll get to those a bit more in a second. Most of those have carried forward. Some of them have extended a little bit. We've got clarity on others. But it's really about making sure that when food is in commerce, when it's moving around by road or by rail, within the United States or heading to the United States, it is safe. It is safe from a time temperature perspective. It's safe from a cross-contamination perspective, which essentially, in very simple terms, falls into making sure that that one item in a vehicle or a rail car does not contaminate another item. So in other words, if you've got exposed food and one of it contains allergens or that, it doesn't get into food. That, say, chemicals don't cross-contaminate. So in other words, cross-contamination during transport. And then the third is, I would characterize as cross-contamination from a dirty vehicle. So I think it really boils down to ensuring time temperature controls and paying attention to agents that could cause public health risk moving between food items or between items in the transport vehicle and from ill-cleaned vehicles. So the principles are pretty clear, and essentially, if you are not moving food around that requires any of those controls, you're kind of exempt. But as I say, we'll get more to those exemptions in just a second. So that's the essence of it, Jill.
Okay, great. Thank you. It's always good to have that distilled down so succinctly, so we certainly appreciate that. Rolando, I would go ahead and move over to you, if you wouldn't mind just covering who's covered by this rule.
Absolutely, Jill, and thank you. Very happy to be here again. Welcome to the audience as well. The scope of the rule, it's pretty much to cover multiple parties that are involved in transporting human and animal food, unless they're exempted by some of the exemptions that David mentioned that we'll cover later on in more detail. These are four in particular: the shippers, the loaders, the carriers, and the receivers of that food. And I thought it was important that we go a little bit over the definitions that the rule contains for each one of these. For example, the shipper, the rule has defined as a person who arranges for transportation of food within the U.S., and that could be by a carrier or multiple carriers. The loader will be the person that physically loads food onto a motor or a rail vehicle during transportation of that food. The carrier will be the person who physically moves food by rail or motor in commerce within the U.S. That does not include persons who are acting as a parcel delivery service. And then the receiver would be any person who receives food at a point in the United States after transportation. And it doesn't matter if that person is the final point of receipt of that food, it will be covered. Now, these different parties may be representing multiple capacities. Let's say a shipper may also be a loader and a carrier, or the loader may also be the carrier, etc. And in fact, they can reassign responsibilities, some of the responsibilities that we will be talking in more detail in a few minutes here, to another party. So they can transfer those responsibilities as long as there is a written agreement between them. And that's going to be part of the documentation requirements as well that are contained in this rule. Now, the rule also applies to other countries or persons within other countries that ship food to the U.S. And arrange for the transfer of any intact container with that food to be transported within the U.S. If that food is going to be consumed or distributed in the U.S. And then companies that are transporting food, just transporting it within the U.S., but with the intent to export, so it's not going to be consumed in the U.S., those are going to be covered by the rule until that shipment reaches a port or a U.S. border. So up to that point, they will be covered by the rule as well. Back to you, Jill.
Okay, great. Thank you. I was sort of taking notes here too, but we'll go ahead and post this in a blog afterwards too. Again, providing clarity on that. Then of course, the old adage goes, well, if who's covered, then who is excluded? And from this rule. And David, why don't you go ahead and address that, please?
Yeah, no, sure. And the rule lays out pretty clearly who's excluded. To me, most of it's logical. There's a couple of things which I'm still scratching my head over, but let's just sort of talk about what they've talked about. Essentially, as with all the rules, it's got who's covered is related to the size of the business. And the rule specifically exempts groups, and this sort of applies to all the categories that Rolando talked about, the shippers, the loaders, the carriers, the receivers. If they have, number one, less than $500,000 in average annual revenues from transport operations over a 3-year period. So it's as always, there's a lower limit, and if it's less than $500,000, then you're exempt. If you are moving food that is transshipped through the United States, so in other words, it's arriving in the U.S. and it's on its way to somewhere else by road or by rail, which by definition would be the Canada or Mexico, then that is exempt. If food is coming into the United States for future export, and that it's not going to be consumed or it's not going to be distributed in the U.S., then that lets you off the hook as well. An interesting change in the final rule is that, and I sort of put this in the context of the proposed rule was starting to include USDA regulated products, but the final rule has essentially exempted those, and the exemption on that one is if you are a loader, shipper, carrier, or receiver, and you're engaged in the transportation from food facilities that are regulated exclusively by the USDA under the Federal Meat Inspection Act, the Poultry Products Act, or the Egg Products Act, then you are exempt. That's a change. The proposed rule included those things. But it does say regulated exclusively, which I'm interpreting as if you are a dual regulated facility and you are producing meat or egg products, poultry products, then you are not exempt. That's just an important little nuance to me. It does use the exclusively word in there. Next exemption is if you are a transportation activity performed by a farm. Now, this is the one that's a bit of a head-scratcher to me, and I've spent time trying to really dissect this because it says activities performed by a farm, which to me means that if you are the farm and you are causing food to be moved from that farm, or you are the farm and you're moving it in a farm vehicle, then you are exempt from the rule. And I think reading some of the preamble language, it's like, well, in fact, you're exempt from this rule, but the movement of food by farms is in fact covered under the produce rule, because we're starting to get into the cleaning, sanitation, the safety of food in relation to equipment that is farm-based. So it's kind of like letting us off the sanitary transport rule, but you're not exempt from maintaining the safety of food if you're shifting it around in a farm-based vehicle, because you're covered under the produce rule. So again, it's a little bit of a nuance. We're not off the hook completely. It's like which rule applies to me, which is always the head scratcher with FSMA is which of these rules apply to me, and that's just a little thought on that one. Touched on this a little bit when I was talking about the purpose of the rule. Exemption: food that's completely enclosed by a container. So if it's entirely enclosed by a container, then it's exempt unless, always there's an unless it requires temperature control for safety. And some of the examples that the agency gives in the regulation about what's considered not completely enclosed, most of it's obvious, but if it's an open basket of food or an open box, ventilated plastic bags, often this question, are they considered to be exposed? And the answer is yes. So if you've got fresh produce and there's little holes in the bags for venting it, that's considered exposed. Other little things, food gases are exempt, food contact substances are exempt, And if you are shipping human food byproducts, in past FSMA Fridays, we talked about those facilities that are making human food and they ship scraps, byproducts off for animal feed, and that human food byproduct is not going to be further processed. In other words, it's going directly to the farm where it's going to be fed directly to livestock. That is excluded. And finally, live animals are excluded, with one, of course, key exception, molluscan shellfish. They are not excluded, but live food animals are. So a little bit of a complex list, Jill, of who's excluded, but it does, for the most part, track with the proposed rule, and I think makes sense. So back to you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Quite a few caveats there, it sounded like. The more I'm thinking about this, the more I think a transcript of this session might be in order to send out to everyone so that they can go through that again. Thank you for that. Let's go ahead and move forward then on talking a little bit about the key requirements for shippers. Rolando, will you share with us?
Absolutely, Jill. And actually, shippers have a key role in this role. They actually have the primary responsibility for determining what are the appropriate transportation conditions of that food and the operations. Unless, of course, as I said before, they are able to enter into an agreement with any other one of the categories that we mentioned, such as a loader, a carrier, etc. But there are some very specific requirements for shippers here, and the first one is to have written procedures that address those vehicles and the transportation equipment, and that includes things such as design and maintenance of those vehicles, making sure, for example, that they are in the appropriate sanitary conditions. So, what's going to be the protocol for cleaning and disinfecting those trucks or those containers, etc. If the food is being transported in bulk, then they also have to make sure that previous cargo is not going to make that food unsafe via contamination. Another one of the requirements as part of transportation operations is temperature control. And that will be, of course, for food that requires temperature control for safety. But in that case, if it is that type of food, then the shippers need to develop and implement written procedures. Again, it has to be a documented procedure to ensure that the food is transported under the adequate temperature. And that includes any pre-cooling that might be needed of the vehicle to ensure that its food is always going to be at the right temperature. There is one exception there for temperature control, and that's if the carrier is transporting food in a thermally insulated tank, then the requirement for temperature control in the vehicle does not apply. Another one of those transportation operations requirements for shippers is that there is proper segregation, and that is to prevent contamination, cross-contamination, of course, between ready-to-eat food and raw food, for example. Another one of the requirements is training of carrier personnel. And that training, according to what I was able to learn, it's going to be an online type of module that the FDA will develop. So it's not going to be a training that carriers need to go and spend a day or day and a half in training. It's just going to be, as long as they have access to a computer and internet, they will be able to complete the training. And then finally, there is documentation, and that includes those written procedures I was talking about. But also the agreements that we discussed, making sure that that's stated clearly. And that's actually what the FDA will view if they were able or they were on site at some point.
Oops, I think we might have lost you. Are you still there, Rolando? David, are you still there?
Yep, no, I'm here.
I think Rolando might have his connection that might have veered off there. So I don't know if there's anything more you could add to that as he calls back in, but it just looked like his connection was lost.
Yeah, no, I think he pretty much covered it, actually, Jill. I think we're about there on the shippers.
Okay, great. Thank you. And hopefully Rolando will be able to call back in. Well, let's go ahead and then move forward on going through some of the key requirements for the loaders and the carriers. And David, obviously, let's have you cover that.
Yeah, I know, absolutely. And if I drop out, hopefully Rolando will be back. It's one of the challenges of doing these things from China.
So far, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just to recap, the final rule kind of puts a lot of the burden of putting in writing exactly how food needs to be moved around safely on the shipper. The shipper's got quite a responsibility to kind of set the requirements. The loader and the carrier have the responsibilities of executing on those requirements in terms of just simple conceptual thinking about how do these different roles apply. So, for example, the loader has to make sure essentially before loading food that's covered by the rule that the vehicle is appropriately clean, of the right temperature, physical condition, free of pests, all of the things that are obvious in terms of safety, as well as following the specific requirements that the shipper has laid out. So if the shipper has required that the temperature in the truck need to be pre-cooled to a certain level for safety, the loader's got to verify that that actually is in place, and obviously track the record. So the loader's job is, from a regulatory perspective, is really to make sure that the vehicle that they're putting food onto is ready to go and is following the requirements of the shipper. The carrier is, as we've been talking about, is the entity that's moving the food around, and once again, the carrier is responsible for tracking with what the shipper is telling them to do. So, and again, as Rolando has said, the shipper can put in writing that the carrier's got other responsibilities and that the carrier just accepts these. So the carrier's got to ensure that the vehicles meet the shipper's specs. Once again, it's a somewhat similar thing. The shipper sets the specifications, the carrier has to make sure that they meet them. The carrier, once the transportation is done, may be requested by the receiver to provide operating temps specified by the shipper. So in other words, the shipper said, this vehicle content needs to be kept at a specific temperature. The carrier has got to make sure that that happens. And the receiver may say to the carrier, okay, carrier, we want evidence that that was all held in place, that the temperatures were met. So it's not, the rule isn't saying that the carrier has to provide that to the receiver. Interestingly, the rule is saying the carrier has to provide that to the receiver if the receiver requests it. So it's a little bit of an interesting twist here. Let's see. I've kind of talked about making sure the refrigeration is solid. That's a part of what the carrier has to do. Another point here is again driven by the shipper. If the carrier is moving food around, they must be able to provide information to the shipper that talks about the previous cargo transported in the vehicle. I'll make a comment there that the proposed rule talked about, I think at one point, the previous 6 cargoes. I see no reference to that. It seems to be now talking about the previous cargo, which makes it a whole lot simpler. If the shipper requests it, the carrier has to provide information to the shipper about the most recent vehicle cleaning procedures. So again, it's if the shipper requests it, but the carrier has to sort of keep track of that. The carrier's got to basically keep records of all of these types of things, such as the cleaning practices that we've just been talking about, how the carrier has to have in writing how they're going to comply with the temperature control requirements that the shipper has requested. So the carrier's got quite a lot of responsibilities, including, as Rolando talked about briefly just before he dropped off, around training of their personnel, which is is like many parts of FSMA, is a fairly prescriptive requirement in terms of making sure that those carrying food understand the basic principles of food safety risk control. So that really speaks to the carriers and the loaders, Jill.
Okay, great. Thank you. And I think Rolando might be back online with us. Rolando, are you there? Or perhaps he's still on mute. I'm saying if you want to mute him. Oh, there you are.
I am.
Rolando.
Yes.
Welcome back. So,
Thank you. Sorry about that.
No. I know you were just wrapping up your part, and then David jumped in and gave a really good review regards to the loaders and the carriers.
Great.
So we'll go ahead and move forward. And since you're back with us, Rolando, why don't you share with us receivers and what do they have to do to comply?
Absolutely, Jill. And in this case, receivers, they have a minor role here. I mean, I'm not going to say minor, but I guess less abbreviated list of responsibilities as compared to some of the other parties that we've been talking about. So in the case of receivers, it only applies to food that requires temperature control for safety, as I was addressing a few minutes ago. And in those cases, they need to ensure that steps have been taken to ensure that the food was not or has not been subjected to significant temperature abuse. And the rule provides a few examples of how they can do that. It could be by measuring the food temperature, determining the ambient temperature of the vehicle, and then the temperature setting against that, or conducting a sensory inspection for any of odors that, of course, will be indication of potential temperature abuse. So pretty much that's what the rule addresses in regards to responsibilities for receivers. Temperature abuse in the case of food that requires temperature control for safety. Back to you, Joe.
Okay, great. Thank you. And moving forward, I think we have one more pre-submitted question here, and I know this on everyone's mind. David, why don't you share just in regards to compliance? When are the dates?
Yep, absolutely. FDA's tracked with the way they've done things in all the other rules. If the dates are staggered based on the size of the operation. But unlike other rules, we kind of got two groups. We've got small businesses, which, like previous rules, is defined as less than 500 full-time equivalent employees, have got two years to comply. So the rule is published on April 6th. So small businesses less than 500 have until April 6th, 2018 to comply. If you are any other business more than 500 full-time employees, then you have until April 6th, 2017, 1 year to comply. There is no 3-year rule for very small businesses. Essentially, as I said earlier, if you are less than $500,000 of revenues from transportation, then you basically are exempt anyway. So just a reminder there, if you're a small business, 2 years, larger than that, 1 year. And that's about it. Pretty simple on compliance.
Okay, good. Thank you. I believe that was our last question that was pre-submitted. We do have just a few, well, a good few, but there are probably 1 or 2 questions that I think would be really applicable to the whole audience. So if we can ask the gentleman from afar to stay on the line with us for about 3 or 4 more minutes, that would be really helpful. Let me go ahead and put one out there. One question is, work for a distribution center. We ship all prepackaged goods. How will we prove we release all responsibility of freight once it leaves our dock? And I don't, who wants to jump on that one? Is David or Rolando?
You know, I'm trying to interpret, Jill, what that question is asking. Can you just reread it again? Let me think.
Yeah,
just read it.
Yeah, I work for a distribution center. We ship all prepackaged goods. How will we prove we release all responsibility of freight once it leaves our dock?
Oh, okay. I think the first question there is prepackaged. If it's prepackaged that doesn't require time temperature control for safety, you're exempt anyway. So keep that in mind. If you're shipping prepackaged, in other words, food that's not exposed, that does not require time temperature control for safety, then you're exempt. That's part of the exemptions. Rolando kind of touched on this, and you know, my thoughts on this, and certainly invite Rolando to add more color to it, is that these rules are all about doing things in writing. FSMA is all about doing things in writing, making sure stuff is written down. So if you've shifted the responsibility for say, an exposed product to the carrier, and you are the shipper of the food, which, remember, the definition of the shipper here is basically the entity that has caused the food to be moved. That may or may not be you. You may actually be the loader. And then once you've done your job as the loader, you're done. The carrier's got responsibilities, the shipper's got responsibilities, the receiver's got responsibilities. So I think if you're in the distribution center, look at what it is you do. Do you figure you're a shipper by the regulatory definition, or a loader, or both? And based on that, determine where your responsibilities begin and where they end, and at what point have you passed them over to the carrier. And you know, I don't think there's a concrete specific point at which that's happened, because it depends on the arrangement that has been made with the carrier in writing. I think that's the key thing, is look at where you sit, look at what you're doing, and get things figured out in writing, so that when the regulators show up, you've got a paper trail as to where your responsibility begins and where it ends. That's my take on that. Rolando, what do you think?
Oh, looks like he might have dropped off again. So he thinks you're right. That's what I'll say.
Yeah, of course he does.
Yes, of course. We'll see if he logs on here, but we'll be wrapping up here in just a few more minutes. You know, David, and I'll just ask just one more, and I recognize, you know, it's well past midnight your time, but I think this one's interesting. How would you define the size of company for an independent trucker? I'm thinking that most truckers are independent contractors, and each has less than $500,000 in annual revenue, therefore exempt from the rule, or again, it might be more when they need to be in compliance.
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. You know, and Christopher's been very patient. He's sitting there probably wondering, and you know, that's an interesting one. So essentially, what the question seems to be, Jill, is where are we sitting with regard to that exemption of less than 500,000 as an independent trucker? Christopher, what do you think? What do you think on that one, and then I'll jump in.
And I think Christopher might be muted, so Thane, if we can unmute his line, that would be great. There he is.
Hi, David. Hi, Jill. Yes, they would be exempt, but they would still have some responsibility, and that would be making sure that when they deliver the load, if they notice anything unusual, they are to tell the loader person if the loader person doesn't notice. For example, if they notice that there's an unusual odor or smell, or if they have indication that they were transporting something that required temperature control and there was a deviation, then they would be obligated to let the loader know, say, hey, you know what, I lost temperature control for about 2 hours on my 5-hour trip.
Okay.
Back to you.
Yeah, I think that's right on. I agree with Christopher completely. I think they would be exempt. I mean, it's pretty clear, less than $500,000, and if you are a legal entity and you as the trucker are a defined legal entity, that's your business, that's what you are, and you know, by legal definitions of the rule, you're a carrier, you're exempt because you're less than 500,000. And Christopher actually touched on an important point that we haven't actually brought out in the discussion, Jill. And just to reemphasize that, is the rule makes it pretty clear. It is like if during the movement of the food something has happened that might cause the food to be adulterated, then the food has to be assessed for risk before it can go into commerce. So it would be considered adulterated. So in other words, if as Christopher says, the carrier has recognized, it's like, oops, you know, my reefer went out, the temperature went out of whack, that in and of itself doesn't constitute adulteration. So you're tracking it's supposed to be 40 degrees, and the carrier notices, oh, it was 41 for half an hour. It's a deviation. It's in the record. That doesn't constitute adulteration necessarily. But if there's a belief that it has become adulterated because it's gone to 60 degrees for 4 hours, and it should have been 40, that's a different problem altogether. And that food has to be evaluated by a qualified individual for its safety to go into commerce. So, Christopher, I think your answer's spot on, and thanks too for raising that other kind of important point that we just hadn't particularly addressed. Back to you, Joe.
Okay, great. Thank you. And, you know, a good few more questions come in. We will take note of those, but we are a little bit out of time, and given our panelists where they're at right now, I'm sure they're ready to call it an evening. Just a few reminders regarding next FSMA Fridays and so forth, but certainly I will always do this. The Acheson Group is a wonderful group of informative consultants, as we know from FSMA Fridays and everything else that they do for the community. So certainly let them help you with FSMA. There's information on how to contact them, or you could go to their site, achesongroup.com. And of course, I'd be remiss not to mention safety chain, and we talk about a lot of this, you know, really is supply chain controls, and having automation in place to help oversee that and have visibility is key, and that's certainly a large component of what our operating platform provides. With that, our upcoming FSMA Friday schedule, a lot of the topics we have coming up are really based on the survey we did earlier in the year, the FSMA Readiness Survey. So based on specific topics that were viewed as gaps of information, we're delighted to host in May a little bit more of a review of food safety plans, pass it to Harpsy, and talk a little bit further in June about final rule for food defense and environmental control programs in July. But as always, as new things come up, we will adjust the schedule as needed. For those of you that are going to be at Food Safety Summit coming up in a few weeks' time, certainly stop by, say hello. Would be delighted to meet many people face-to-face versus on the phone. And then, of course, the Acheson Group always has great resources on their site, and I encourage you to visit them. So with that, my goodness, thank you so much to David, Rolando, and Christopher for hanging on with us today. Very informative session as well. Thank you, gentlemen.
Pleasure, Jill. Thank you.
And as mentioned, I think this one really merits it, and probably most of them do. We could start putting more of a transcript out there with our post-blogs on FSMA Fridays, because as usual, very informative session. So with that, happy FSMA Fridays to everyone from near and afar. Thank you, and we look forward to have you online or seeing you in person soon.
Thank you.